So Bill Connolly from ESPN, pretty neat. He does a lot of stats. The updated 2024 returning production rankings in college football. This includes, as of I think a day or two ago, anybody that's entered or joined a team in the portal who was on somebody else's team, so his production counts for whoever he might be playing for now. Iowa State, we knew that. We didn't know they were at the top, but we knew Iowa State had a chunk back. Oklahoma State, a nice chunk back. And then Baylor, we knew they had a lot of players, time, whatever, coming back. Just how much of that is enough talent to get them to a bowl game this year?
Well, considering that, they didn't make one. Virginia wasn't. I'm looking at the teams on the list. A lot of these teams, a lot of talent coming back, weren't very good.
Iowa was good enough.
Iowa was good. Iowa State was good. Stanford wasn't good. Oklahoma State was really good. Virginia Tech was improved. Rice was better than they have. Is that Rice? I'm seeing
yes.
there. Norfolk.
Yes.
Sorry. Virginia.
Mice.
Virginia wasn't very good. Hawaii wasn't very good. USF wasn't very good.
So about 6 or 7 of those teams are a lot of players back from a team. And I hate to say this, but I had a high school coach one time tell me, I said, you have 20 returning starters. Yeah, we were 0-10.
Yeah.
You don't sometimes want that. Yeah. He was joking in a way.
No, I talked to a high school coach one time that said, you lost 20 starters. And he's like, I missed 2 of them.
Yeah. I mean, there is some of that. I mean, you want to have turnover, and some of these schools weren't good, but I think you point to Baylor or you point to Iowa State in particular, and you could say, well, it's good to have returning production because you were really suffering from a lack of experience last year, and now you have returning experience. So in the case of Baylor, like you look at what they did last year and you go, yeah, that was a 3-9 season. Why would you want most of that team back? Well, because a lot of the guys are getting their heads kicked in were redshirt sophomores and redshirt freshmen or true freshmen. And so the thought is that they come back now with that experience and that they will be better. But this isn't the end-all, be-all, but it is at least something of interest to look at. And the good teams that have a lot of guys coming back, well, you feel pretty great about them because it's already proven successful and they've got most of those guys back. So I think with Oklahoma State, that's especially encouraging that you have so much coming back considering you finished second in the league last year and you won 10 games. So that's very promising for them. With Iowa State, you won 7 games, but you had a young team, young quarterback. You had the gambling issue that kind of just, I guess, didn't derail you clearly, but it definitely messed with just sort of the feel around the program initially before the season started with and threw you for a little bit of a loop. Let's say that. It threw you for a loop, and you had to make up for the fact that all of a sudden you were missing multiple starters and contributors because of this unforeseen gambling situation. So for them to still finish 7-6 and have a boatload of that team coming back, I think that plays really well in the minds of Cyclone fans that they should be expected to take a step up and win, 8 or 9 games and compete for the title this year. I mean, if you look at where they finished last year, 2 of the teams that finished above them aren't in the league anymore, and the only other one was Oklahoma State. So I think you feel great about that. So, Oklahoma State, Iowa State, I didn't know that they were 1-3 in the entire country. But if you wanted to go ahead and predict them to be in the Big 12 title game, I don't think that's a crazy prediction. I understand Utah, I understand Arizona, but, if Iowa State, Oklahoma State's entirely possible. Mm-hmm. And then with Baylor, like I said, I think them in particular, that's just they had so much youth that you hope that the experience makes them a better team in the long run. And I'd imagine it's just a mixture of the same cases for everybody else on this list, but we obviously know a bit more about all of those 3. But it's always interesting to look at. There is some correlation, as Bill points out in his explanations, for those who have wondered about, what exactly does this mean? It doesn't guarantee success by any means, but a lot of the teams that were at the top of this list last year ended up being pretty successful because returning production can be a huge benefit for you. So, it's always interesting to see this list.
Iowa State bowl game, Oklahoma State bowl game, Virginia Tech bowl game, USF was 7-6 bowl game, and Iowa. So 5 of those 10, and Rice was 6 of those 10 returning from teams that already were able to make a bowl game last year.
Bill Connolly, meanwhile, the one who at least for me initially, was the one to introduce the idea of relegation into college football, and not push it, but throw that idea out there and promote it as a concept maybe that college football could pivot towards, although, that seems very unlikely at this point, and yet we seem closer to that possibility than ever before, because quite frankly, any possibility other than the way they've always done things is closer than ever before. But yeah, he also is. It's just interesting because we've talked a lot about that here lately, somebody that's championed that. So I always enjoy his work and when we've had him on from time to time.
I've seen a lot of people do things like we did the other day. We were trying to figure it out, but I mean, relegation for college football, if you look at the way that the Premier League and all that works, is that there's, the reason it works that way, there's so many teams. I mean, the Premier League alone, you think about, Great Britain and the British Isles, that's not that really big of a place, but every town has a football club. Everyone has one. So it's not like the NFL where there's 32 teams. So they had to come up with a system that was effective, that worked. So that's why for college football, because there's so many teams, that relegation seems like it would be more feasible than it would be in any other.
How many years with football in Europe? Is it every year, or is it a 3-year average?
Every year.
Okay.
It's every year.
All right.
But then, with that, there comes a lot of other questions. It's not. It wouldn't be an exact carbon copy. My whole point last week was, don't call it a super league if it includes the bottom feeders. That was just my whole point. If you want to call it the major league, if you want to call it League One, if you want to call it whatever, but just for me, my interpretation of Super League, and when I hear that, I'm thinking of what soccer tried to create before fans lost their minds, which was all the best teams, and that's what it was. It was going to be the elite of the elite. So when I hear Super League, me personally, I consider that to be the elite of the elite, and so therefore, it doesn't include a couple, let's a dozen teams from those two leagues, the SEC and the ACC, or the SEC and the Big Ten combined. And that's where I was coming from. Now, somebody else can consider it differently, but I just don't think you can consider it to be the best of the best and not really be the best of the best solely.
You cannot have teams that are not a part of those two conferences, who are not a part of so-called Super League or whatever, just because they weren't born into a conference.
Right, yeah, exactly.
That's
my
what
point.
you're saying. There's a lot of teams.
To me, that's the best of the best. The Premier League is the best of the. They've earned it there, and they were the best.
If you're
of the
not
best.
a part of the Premier League in college football, do you get the same amount of money if you're on that next level, or are you going to get?
Of course not.
Okay.
By the way, one of the comments on that video that we did was he was stop picking on Vandy.
I even said that.
I said that. We're using the example of Vandy, but he used the example. Look, Tulane and Georgia Tech were both SEC members as well, and you got to throw them in there. Well, yeah, but they were dumb enough to leave.
Right. Yeah, benefit of hindsight. Decades later, Tulane would still have been in the SEC. No, I mean, that was obviously a different time, different place, different circumstances. But I mean, to that person, if they ever watch again, I said at some point, because I knew we were picking on Vandy, but they were just the easy target.
There's only a couple we can pick on, like Vandy and Rutgers. And
well, we just said there's
Northwestern.
And with the example that we were doing of trying to create, okay, these teams have done something, these teams have not. And again, it's different. Understand the structure and the money and the way that organizational goals at each university is different. But Vandy's the easy example in the SEC because they're the ones who seem the least likely to do it out of all the teams in that league.
Let's face it, they are not like Alabama and Georgia and so forth. And so, I mean, if you were to take a bunch of teams from other leagues and put them in there, they'd take that spot. But that just so happens to be where they are. But to be fair, I also picked on Arkansas. And I also picked on I picked on A&M a little bit.
South
Carolina. I said all of them would not be in the type of a league that I'm talking about. They would have to earn their way in. They wouldn't automatically just get that selection. So I was fair. I just said the whole Big 12 wouldn't be a part of it. So we were fair. We were carving it down, and you had to cut somewhere. But, we were definitely self-aware of how easy of a target Vandy can be because they're just sort of the default answer, but they certainly aren't alone in that conversation.
And we were at least 5 or 6 times saying this is not to pick on Vandy, but we were. Cornelio, any sort of relegation would flat out kill quite a few programs.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much to it. I mean, again, it wouldn't be if they ever went down that road, which I don't know if that'll ever be the case. I have a hard time, as much as we talk about TV ratings and the money and all of it siphoning up of there's still going to be a need for broadcasting games. There's still going to be a need for these communities to thrive and have these types of investments locally, and for players to have spots, guys. Like you're just going to just send players into the ether world because they don't cut it at this certain 22, 24 team level, or 40 team or whatever it may be. 40 team's not a super league. That's my whole point of the conversation. It's not a super league. But, I don't buy into the whole, everything else is going to shrivel up and die. I don't believe that. I think that's just fear-mongering. I think there's going to be a place for all the programs that are out there. Now, are some going to have drastically different futures than they expected? Potentially, but I still don't think we know for sure what any of that truly looks like. And as much as we assume the motivations of Greg Sankey or Tony Petitti or whoever, who really knows besides those folks of what the end goal looks like for them? It does feel like there is going to be a different separation of some sort, but does that result in everybody else just withering up and dying on the vine? Absolutely not. So I think that's just overly dramatic.
That's how I feel about wholesale canceling of sports, which I do think is that's a long down the line threat. It's a
valid concern.
It's a valid concern.
Yeah. But when we're talking about football, football's not going anywhere.
Football's not going anywhere any place. If you're worried about your football program getting canceled, they must literally be causing ecological damage to your area. There's no way that you could. They're just not, because that's the one that's going to bring in the most money. And then you move on down the line. And look, that's why there's protections for Title IX. And look, everybody's like, well, the settlement could lead to canceling sports. Well, I think that's where, some of the work with Title IX will help in that, they're not going to cancel a lot of sports. They're just going to have to accept the reality that there's not going to be as much of a money grab at the top, and they're going to have to distribute that down. So what they're anytime you hear I would caution anybody on anything when you hear the panic side of it, well, we're just gonna have to cancel sports. You're yeah, but you have a football facility that spent $3 million on putting laser tag or something in there. If you don't do those things into the future, and you can take that $3 million and don't put those there, you can put those into softball or whatever, and everything should be fine. You just can't exorbitantly spend on one thing anymore.
Right. Yeah. Think about fans revolting against a sport that right now is the number 2 sport in America.
Yeah, it's very popular. Now, the concern is that you don't make that same type of money. That's the whole thing with these conferences and these TV payouts. There is a legitimate concern there. I'm just saying the overall, oh my gosh, everybody not named these 40 are going to fall off a cliff in football. Monetarily, to some extent, sure, but I still think the Big 12's doing A-okay. They're not making Big 10 money or SEC money, and probably aren't going to unless they win national championships. But I think they're still going to have very healthy programs. They're just not going to be able to – I think the thing that people are having a hard time coming to grips with more than anything is just the idea that their team may not be able to, quote-unquote, compete on the same level as Ohio State, whereas before you always believed that you could in some form or fashion. Even though the Buckeyes had more money than God and, more fans and all that, you still knew that, any given Saturday you could maybe go and match up and line up and beat them because there were still rules that kept you fairly somewhat in the same ballpark, whereas in the next several years – with all of the changes, you're living in completely different worlds. And that's just that kind of a separation is more of the realistic separation, I feel like, that people are alarmed for, because you just want to feel like you're competing at that top level, that level one, so to speak. But I know we've gone off on a tangent here.
Yeah, this was about production returning, but it ended up being a great conversation. And now let's look at the remaining, other the Iowa State, Oklahoma State, Baylor. Here are the remaining or incoming included Big 12 teams with their production. Colorado State, I'm not going to give you all of the numbers. They're on the left-hand side. Colorado, 17. Then you have 3 teams in the 30s, West Virginia, Arizona, TCU. Utah and Arizona State in the 40s, BYU at 54. UCF, Cincinnati, and Tech in the 60s. Houston, 61% returning. And then Kansas and Kansas State with 59% returning production from a year ago. Those are the remaining Big 12 teams.
I would also say that Kansas State in particular has added some production from, they took some from Colorado and added it to them, that 71% with Dylan Edwards. So, they may not have a lot returning.
Plus, you need to multiply Jalen Daniels by 2 or 3 because of games missed.
And then, look, you have Will Howard that left, but you have Avery Johnson who's going to replace him, and you already kind of know how that's going to go. So, Yeah, well, I don't know. It's an interesting metric to see because some of the teams, like Colorado, is 71% of their production returning, but most of that offensive production was between about 4 players.
Yeah,
like it really was. I mean, so they didn't have a lot. So it's weird because it's a really hard metric to make even for everybody.
Well, it's not like it's the end all be all. It's just it's a fun thing to be able to look at and consider along with various other statistics or metrics that you want to put in your little formula to help you spit out what you think a team's going to look like. But it is a valuable thing to see, especially, like I said, when there's good teams that have a lot returning that should indicate that they're going to be pretty good again. Or if you look a little deeper, like we were saying with, an Iowa State of having so much back from a team that was able to get to a bowl game despite a little bit of a hiccup there at the beginning of the season. I mean, that's boding well for you. So, yeah, I mean, interesting to see Kansas State at the bottom of that list, but yeah, I think you still feel really good about where they are. They definitely lose some big-time contributors, though. I mean, you don't just lose Ben Sinnott and guys like that and not feel it whatsoever.
BB,
no matter how good your quarterback is. So
yeah,
I think that's worth taking into consideration. Texas Tech does not have a lot of returning production back, which is something I had seen a few months ago, but that's still just interesting given sort of where they are in the landscape of things. So I don't know how to quite read that, frankly. But, yeah, it's interesting to look through and kind of come up with your own feeling on what exactly it means.
None of this might matter. It depends. Maybe somebody who did not have any returning production ends up jumping into a different stratosphere. Now, here's a list of the teams that are not a part of the Big 12 for next year, and then just some notable names. SMU would be 11th, 78%. We've discussed what Rhett Lashlee and company have coming back. Georgia at 28, Texas and A&M right there next to each other, and then Oklahoma 53rd. This is out of 131 schools. Ohio State, LSU, that's okay. Then look at the ones you knew. Alabama had their roster rated plus the transition, 100. Washington, same thing, 126. In Michigan, 130. All 3 had coaching changes and or a retirement, and they're at the bottom of the list.
Well, and they had massive players. Look, Washington had a ton of players, before you even talk about transfer portal, in the NFL. Michigan had a ton of players in the NFL. Alabama had a ton of players in the NFL. And then you throw the portal on top of that, it makes it that much more daunting. LSU is not so surprising considering that Jaden Daniels was most of the offense, and the 2 guys he threw the ball to, the 3 first-round offensive talents they had, not a shocker. And then they lost, Logan Diggs, the running back in the transfer portal. So I would say of the 41% they lost, I think I just told you about 29% of it.
LSU is going to be really interesting, man. They lost a lot of production.
Yeah.
And they're pretty far down, but not like, I mean, obviously the 3 of the 4 playoff teams, I mean, only Texas is sitting there somewhat respectably returning most of their roster. And, yeah, it's hard to imagine a scenario where Alabama, Washington, or Michigan are just right back in that playoff based on just the amount of talent that they lost. But, it's doable, I suppose. But I think it's going to be a real uphill battle, and that's one of those things that this sort of can lead you to conclusion-wise is, you can replenish, but it also takes into account transfer portal and things like that. So, it's going to be an uphill battle to try and get back to where you were if you were Alabama, Washington, and Michigan, not even taking into account the coaching changes at all 3 of those places. So, yeah, that'll be a hill to climb. I think Texas is set up really well still for their entry into the SEC. They did lose a lot of talent, but, I mean, some of your main – as much as you're going to miss, the big uglies on the defensive line or, a defender here and there, and obviously receivers, I think some of those spots you feel pretty good about just replenishing, especially, losing an Adonai Mitchell or an Xavier Worthy. You may not replicate them exactly, but I think you're going to have enough tools in the cup in the chest to be able to at least come close to that. So I think Texas, I do eye them a little bit because I do think that they had a really good run and had a really nice roster, and they are, getting hit with some notable departures. But I think they're about set up as well as you could possibly have hoped for entering the SEC in year number 1.
Well, they have the positions. They lost a ton the draft. We know about that, but also they replaced some of that. They did scratch and claw to try to get people back to help them on the defensive line. Not back, but in the portal. They got the kid from Arizona. Then they picked up the late one from Oklahoma, too. And let's not forget they have players at the high school level, but you almost forget about them now because of the way it is.
The biggest deal, I think, with Texas coming back, it's not going to be their offensive production. I think they've replaced pretty ably, especially when you talk about Isaiah Bond and Matthew Golden and Silas Bolden all coming into that wide receiver room. Those are guys who have produced at very high levels on the other places they've been. It's going to be tough, not just the defensive tackles, but they lost Jalen Ford. They lost, the middle of that defense is going to be
Brooks.
Yeah. Terrence Brooks. That the middle of the defense to me in particular is going to be the most interesting thing. Can they stuff the run at the level they did last year? That's going to be hard to replicate. If they can just get but here's the thing. They kind of overdid it in that they did more than they needed to win most games in stopping the run last year. If they can kind of get close, they'll still be totally fine.
All right, it's